Have you ever wondered why, even after promising yourself never again, you keep falling back into the same addictions? Why do some habits seem to have an almost magnetic power over us? The answer may be hidden in the depths of your unconscious. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychiatrists of all time, revealed a disturbing secret. Your addiction isn't just a bad habit. It's a primitive force that feeds on your own denial. While most people fight their compulsions using willpower alone, Jung discovered that this approach actually strengthens the dependency. In the next few minutes, I'll reveal to you the real reason why your addictions persist, and why everything you've tried so far may be secretly sabotaging your liberation. What Jung discovered about the human mind will completely transform your understanding of addiction, and may finally offer the path to true freedom. Have you ever noticed how the things you try hardest to eliminate from your life often become the most powerful? This is no coincidence. According to Carl Jung's profound understanding of the human psyche, our addictions find sanctuary in what he called the shadow, that hidden part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. Think about it. The more you push something away, the stronger its grip becomes on your unconscious mind. Jung discovered that our psyche operates like an ecosystem seeking balance. When we consciously reject aspects of ourselves, our desires, impulses, or perceived weaknesses, they don't simply disappear. Instead, they retreat into the unconscious, into this shadow realm, where they gain strength beyond our awareness. Your addiction isn't just a habit. It's a disowned part of yourself demanding to be seen. What makes this particularly insidious is that we often don't recognize this process happening. You might believe you're making progress because you're actively fighting your urges, but in reality, you're feeding the very thing you're trying to overcome. The shadow doesn't respond to combat, it grows stronger through denial. Consider how many times you've promised to quit something, only to find yourself drawn back with even greater intensity. Jung would explain this as your psyche's attempt to restore wholeness. The more vigorously you reject a part of yourself, the more it asserts its existence through compulsive behavior. This shadow realm houses not just our darkest impulses, but also our unacknowledged needs. Perhaps your addiction serves as a substitute for connection, meaning, or a sense of control. Maybe it temporarily fills a void you haven't consciously recognized. Your dependence on substances, behaviors, or relationships often masks a deeper psychological need that remains unaddressed. Jung emphasized that these dependencies aren't random. They're symbolic expressions of something missing in your conscious life. The specific form your addiction takes holds psychological significance. It's a message from your unconscious, trying to communicate what you've been ignoring. The substance or behavior you can't seem to give up is often connected to qualities or experiences your conscious mind has rejected. The shadow also houses your unlived potential. Jung noted that many addictions represent misdirected creative or spiritual energy. When your natural talents and authentic self-expression remain undeveloped, that energy doesn't disappear. It manifests in distorted ways. What could have been artistic expression becomes compulsive consumption. What might have been spiritual connection becomes dependence on external validation. Your addiction persists because, on some level, it represents truth about yourself that you haven't integrated. Until you acknowledge this, no amount of willpower or behavior modification will create lasting change. The shadow cannot be eliminated. It can only be recognized, understood, and eventually integrated into your conscious identity. What makes this especially challenging is our natural resistance to looking inward. Society encourages us to focus on external solutions rather than internal understanding. We're taught to fight bad habits rather than questioning what those habits might represent. Jung recognized that this approach fundamentally misunderstands how the psyche heals and transforms. The journey toward freedom begins not with greater discipline, but with greater awareness. By turning toward your shadow rather than away from it, you initiate the process of reclaiming these disowned parts of yourself. This isn't about indulging destructive behaviors, but about understanding their psychological purpose. Only by acknowledging the shadow's existence can you begin to integrate what it contains in healthier, more conscious ways. The moment you declare war on your addiction, you've already fallen into a psychological trap that Jung identified decades ago. Think about how we typically approach unwanted habits, through resistance, suppression, and conflict. We use language like battling addiction or fighting urges. According to Jung's insights, this combative stance actually reinforces the very behavior you're trying to eliminate. Jung discovered a paradoxical truth about the human mind. What you resist persists. When you position your addiction as an enemy to be conquered, you unconsciously elevate its importance and power. This adversarial relationship creates a psychological division within yourself, a split between the part that wants to change and the part that clings to the familiar pattern. Rather than resolving your addiction, this internal conflict often perpetuates it. Your conscious mind might believe it's making progress through forceful rejection, but your unconscious operates by different rules. The unconscious doesn't recognize negation in the same way your conscious mind does. When you focus intensely on not doing something, the unconscious mind still registers preoccupation with that thing. This is why people who constantly think about not eating sugar often find themselves even more fixated on sweet foods. Jung observed that this oppositional approach creates what he called compensation, an unconscious counterbalance to one-sided conscious attitudes. The more extremely you position yourself against your addiction, the more powerful the compensatory response becomes. This explains why periods of rigid restraint are often followed by overwhelming relapses. Your psyche seeks equilibrium, and extreme positions in either direction trigger an equal and opposite reaction. This dynamic becomes particularly evident in the cycle many addicted people experience. Intense resolve, followed by intense shame. You promise yourself you'll change, maintain control briefly, then slip back into old patterns. Each failure reinforces your sense of powerlessness and inadequacy. What you don't realize is that this cycle itself becomes addictive. The drama of resolution and relapse provides emotional intensity that distracts from deeper issues. Jung noted that behind many addictions lies a profound fear, not just of the addiction itself, but of what might be revealed if we truly faced ourselves. Fighting addiction keeps us safely preoccupied with the symptoms rather than confronting the underlying causes. It's easier to battle a bad habit than to question fundamental aspects of how you live, what you believe, or who you think you are. This avoidance creates another problem. The more you fight against unwanted impulses, the more disconnected you become from yourself. Jung emphasized the importance of self-knowledge as the foundation for psychological healing. When you're constantly rejecting parts of your experience, you lose access to crucial information about your authentic needs, desires, and wounds. This self-alienation makes genuine transformation impossible. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Consider how many recovery attempts focus exclusively on stopping the unwanted behavior without addressing the emotional and psychological functions it serves. Jung would view this as treating the symptom while ignoring the underlying condition. Without understanding why you're drawn to certain substances or behaviors, you're likely to either remain dependent or simply shift your addiction to something else. The path forward isn't about summoning more willpower or strengthening your defenses. It involves a fundamental shift in orientation, moving from opposition to curiosity, from rejection to understanding. Jung advocated for a compassionate relationship with all aspects of yourself, even those you find troubling or shameful. This doesn't mean surrendering to destructive impulses, but rather approaching them with awareness rather than judgment. True freedom from addiction comes not through conquest, but through conversation, learning to listen to what your unwanted behaviors are trying to tell you. Every dependency holds information about your unmet needs, unprocessed emotions, or undeveloped potential. By meeting these aspects of yourself with acceptance rather than aggression, you create the conditions for genuine transformation. The confrontation that leads to healing isn't a battle, but a dialogue with the parts of yourself you've been denying. Every day, your mind plays an elaborate game of deception, not with others, but with yourself. Jung recognized that our ego, the conscious part of our personality that we identify as me, often creates sophisticated defenses to maintain its familiar sense of identity. These psychological masks, or what Jung called personas, serve as protective shields that prevent us from seeing our dependencies for what they truly are. Your ego doesn't want to admit that it's not fully in control. It creates what Jung termed rationalizations, seemingly logical explanations that justify your behavior while hiding its true nature. Have you noticed how easily you can convince yourself that just this once won't hurt, or that you deserve your particular indulgence after a hard day? These aren't rational decisions, but the ego's attempt to maintain its illusion of choice while serving the addiction. Jung observed that many people construct elaborate self-narratives that allow their dependencies to continue unchallenged. You might tell yourself you drink only socially, even as social events become increasingly centered around opportunities to drink. Or perhaps you frame your workaholism as ambition and responsibility, never questioning why you can't find peace in stillness. The ego excels at creating stories that protect us from uncomfortable truths. What makes these masks particularly effective is that they're partially true. Your justifications aren't complete fabrications. They contain elements of reality that make them believable. This half-truth quality makes them difficult to recognize and challenge. The overworker truly is productive and responsible. The social drinker genuinely does enjoy the company of others. The truth and the deception are intertwined, making the mask nearly invisible. Another powerful disguise is what Jung would recognize as projection, the unconscious transfer of your own unacknowledged qualities onto others. You might focus intensely on other people's dependencies while remaining blind to your own. This outward focus serves as the perfect distraction from self-examination. By seeing addiction as something that happens to those people, your ego maintains the comforting illusion that you're fundamentally different. Jung also identified how the ego uses displacement to hide addiction. Your conscious mind might proudly resist one form of dependency while unconsciously transferring the same psychological pattern to something seemingly more acceptable. You might overcome alcohol only to become obsessed with exercise or replace gambling with equally compulsive investing. The underlying psychological dynamic remains unchanged, merely wearing a more socially acceptable mask. Perhaps the most subtle disguise is what Jung would describe as intellectualization, using abstract thinking to disconnect from emotional reality. You might become an expert on addiction, able to analyze its mechanisms in detail, while never applying this understanding to your own behavior. This intellectual approach creates the illusion of addressing the problem while actually keeping it at a safe distance. The ego also protects itself through what Jung called compartmentalization, keeping contradictory aspects of yourself separated in your conscious mind. You become adept at not connecting the dots between your behavior and its consequences, between your stated values and your actual choices. This fragmentation prevents you from seeing the full picture of your dependency. Why does the ego work so hard to maintain these deceptions? Jung understood that facing our dependencies requires confronting painful truths about ourselves. It means acknowledging vulnerability, unmet needs, and aspects of our character that don't match our idealized self-image. The ego resists this awareness because it threatens its familiar structure and sense of control. Yet these very masks that seem to protect us actually imprison us. As long as your ego successfully maintains these illusions, genuine change remains impossible. Jung recognized that transformation begins only when we become willing to see through our own deceptions, not with harsh judgment, but with honest recognition of our complex humanity. The path forward involves developing what Jung called consciousness, the capacity to recognize your own patterns with clarity and compassion. This doesn't happen through force, but through patient self-observation. As you learn to identify these masks when they appear, they gradually lose their power over you. The addiction that thrives in darkness begins to weaken when exposed to the light of awareness. Beneath the surface of your conscious choices lies a powerful psychological mechanism that Jung identified, one that keeps you locked in patterns of dependency despite your best intentions to break free. This is the principle of compensation, a natural balancing function of the psyche that operates largely outside your awareness, creating an invisible trap that perpetuates addiction. Jung discovered that the human psyche constantly seeks equilibrium, much like a scale trying to find balance. When your conscious attitude becomes extreme or one-sided, your unconscious automatically generates an opposing force to restore balance. This compensation occurs whether you're aware of it or not, operating according to its own internal logic rather than your conscious wishes. Consider how this cycle typically unfolds in addiction. You might begin with rigid self-control, denying yourself completely and adopting an extreme position of restraint. According to Jung's understanding, this severe conscious attitude creates an equal and opposite unconscious pressure. The more tightly you restrict yourself, the more powerful the compensatory urge becomes, eventually erupting in what feels like an uncontrollable impulse to indulge. After giving in to this impulse, you likely experience shame and recommit to even stricter control, thus intensifying the cycle. Each time this pattern repeats, it becomes more entrenched in your psychological landscape. What you don't realize is that both the restraint and the release are part of the same system. They feed into each other, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that actually stabilizes the addiction rather than resolving it. Jung noted that this compensatory function serves an important purpose in healthy psychological development. It prevents one-sided growth and ensures that neglected aspects of the self eventually demand attention. However, in addiction, this natural balancing mechanism becomes distorted into a destructive pattern that traps you in alternating states of denial and indulgence. What makes this cycle particularly difficult to break is its invisible nature. You experience only the conscious side of the equation, your intentions, decisions, and apparent choices. The unconscious compensatory forces remain largely hidden, emerging as seemingly random urges, emotional states, or external circumstances that make you return to the addictive behavior. Without understanding this hidden dynamic, you remain confused about why your determination repeatedly fails. Another aspect of this cycle involves what Jung termed inflation and deflation of the ego. When you successfully maintain control, your ego often becomes inflated, overconfident in its power and ability to master your impulses. This inflation creates the conditions for its opposite, a painful deflation when you inevitably fall short of perfect self-mastery. This emotional roller coaster itself becomes addictive, as the dramatic swings provide a kind of psychological intensity that distracts from deeper issues. Jung observed that many people unconsciously arrange their lives to maintain this cycle. You might place yourself in situations that virtually guarantee relapse, or associate with people who undermine your efforts to change, not because you consciously want to fail, but because the psyche is preserving its familiar pattern. The addiction provides a certain psychological stability, even if a destructive one. The compensation cycle also manifests in how you relate to pleasure and pain. Jung recognized that an excessively pleasure-seeking attitude eventually generates its painful opposite, while excessive self-denial creates an overwhelming hunger for release. Many addictions begin as simple pleasure-seeking, but transform into complex pain management systems as the cycle intensifies. Eventually, you find yourself using the addiction less for enjoyment and more to escape the discomfort of not engaging in it. Breaking free from this invisible trap requires understanding its cyclical nature. Rather than approaching addiction as a simple matter of self-control, Jung would encourage recognizing the compensatory dynamics at play. Freedom comes not through greater force of will, but through finding a middle path that doesn't trigger these extreme compensatory reactions. This middle path involves developing greater psychological flexibility, the ability to navigate between discipline and allowance, structure and spontaneity. Rather than swinging between all-or-nothing positions, you learn to maintain a more balanced stance that acknowledges both your need for limits and your need for expression. By avoiding psychological extremes, you reduce the unconscious pressure for equally extreme compensation. At the heart of Jung's understanding of psychology lies a profound concept that offers hope for those caught in addiction's grip. This concept, individuation, represents not just freedom from dependency, but a completely different relationship with yourself and your life. Unlike conventional approaches that focus merely on stopping unwanted behaviors, Jung's path addresses the root cause of why we become addicted in the first place. Individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, of integrating the various parts of yourself into a coherent whole. Jung recognized that many psychological problems, including addiction, stem from a disconnection from this authentic self. When you live according to external expectations, societal norms, or rigid self-imposed rules rather than your deeper nature, you create the perfect conditions for dependency to take root. What makes individuation so powerful as a response to addiction is that it doesn't just treat symptoms, it addresses the fundamental imbalance in your psyche. Rather than asking, "How do I stop this behavior?" it poses a more meaningful question: who am I meant to become? This shift in focus transforms recovery from a negative process of elimination to a positive journey of discovery and creation. Jung observed that many addicted people are actually thwarted in their individuation process. Your dependency often represents a substitute for authentic growth, a counterfeit version of the transformation your soul truly seeks. The temporary relief or artificial stimulation provided by addiction stands in for the genuine fulfillment that comes from living in alignment with your deepest self. Unlike the cycle of addiction, which keeps you trapped in repetitive patterns, individuation follows a spiral path of increasing consciousness and integration. Each time you face and incorporate a previously rejected aspect of yourself, you become more whole. This wholeness naturally reduces the inner fragmentation that drives addictive behavior. When you're no longer at war with parts of yourself, the compulsive need to escape through external substances or behaviors diminishes. Jung emphasized that individuation isn't about achieving perfection, but about embracing your humanity in all its complexity. This includes acknowledging your limitations, vulnerabilities, and even your capacity for destruction. Paradoxically, it's often this honest acceptance that frees you from acting out these tendencies in harmful ways. By consciously owning your shadow aspects, rather than projecting or suppressing them, You gain choice where before there was only compulsion. Central to the individuation process is developing a relationship with what Jung called the self, the organizing center of the psyche that extends beyond the limited ego. Unlike the ego, which identifies with only certain aspects of your personality, the self encompasses the totality of who you are, both conscious and unconscious. As your connection with this deeper center strengthens, you become less dependent on external sources for fulfillment or identity. This path requires courage because it means facing what you've been avoiding through addiction. Jung noted that dependencies often serve as shields against anxiety, emptiness, or painful emotions. Individuation asks you to turn toward these experiences rather than away from them. Not to wallow in suffering, but to discover the wisdom and growth that lie on the other side of difficult feelings. Unlike the quick fix promised by addiction, individuation unfolds gradually over time. It involves patience and trust in the natural healing capacity of your psyche. Jung observed that this process has its own timing and cannot be forced or controlled by the ego's demands. This requires developing a different relationship with time itself, learning to value slow, authentic progress over immediate relief or escape. Individuation also differs from addiction in its relationship to meaning. While dependency often represents an attempt to fill an inner emptiness, individuation involves discovering the unique purpose and meaning of your individual life. Jung found that many people recover from addiction not by focusing directly on the unwanted behavior, but by finding something more compelling to live for, something that engages their whole being rather than just temporarily numbing their pain. Perhaps most importantly, individuation offers something addiction never can: genuine freedom. Not the illusory freedom of temporary escape, but the deeper liberty that comes from knowing yourself fully and making choices from that knowledge. As you become more integrated, you're no longer driven by unconscious forces beyond your understanding. The energy previously consumed by inner conflict becomes available for creative living. The path Jung outlined doesn't promise an easy solution to addiction, but it offers something more valuable: transformation. Instead of simply returning to who you were before dependency took hold, you emerge as someone more whole, more authentic, and more alive. The journey through addiction, when approached through the lens of individuation, becomes not just a recovery of what was lost, but a discovery of what you never knew was possible. The final piece of Jung's profound insight into addiction reveals a truth rarely acknowledged in conventional recovery approaches. True healing doesn't come from purging your unwanted impulses or achieving perfect self-control. It comes from something seemingly counterintuitive, integrating the very aspects of yourself that you've been trying to eliminate. This process, shadow integration, represents the deepest level of psychological work and potentially the most transformative. Jung discovered that the shadow, that repository of disowned qualities and impulses, can never be successfully eliminated. The more you try to cut it away, the more it asserts itself through symptomatic behaviors like addiction. The alternative approach he proposed involves turning toward your shadow with conscious awareness and acceptance, gradually incorporating its energy into your conscious personality in healthier forms. This integration process begins with a fundamental shift in attitude. Rather than viewing your addictive tendencies as enemies to be conquered, you learn to see them as messengers carrying important information about your psychological needs. Every dependency, viewed through this lens, represents a distorted attempt to meet a legitimate human need for connection, meaning, comfort, stimulation, or escape from unbearable emotions. Jung emphasized that the shadow contains not only destructive impulses, but also vitality, creativity, and authenticity that you've disowned. Your addiction often represents misdirected life force, energy that could power meaningful pursuits and genuine passion if properly channeled. Integration involves reclaiming this energy and redirecting it toward more conscious and constructive expression. What makes shadow work particularly challenging is that it requires facing parts of yourself that may be genuinely disturbing. Jung never suggested that all unconscious content is benign or should be expressed directly. Some impulses are genuinely destructive and require transformation, not just acceptance. The key distinction lies in how this transformation happens, not through rejection, but through conscious relationship. Integration happens through specific psychological processes that Jung identified. The first is acknowledgement, simply recognizing that these disowned aspects exist within you. This seemingly simple step often proves surprisingly difficult, as it challenges your established self-image. Yet this recognition itself begins to reduce the shadow's unconscious power, bringing its energy into the sphere of conscious choice. The second process involves understanding the origin and purpose of these shadow elements. Many addictive patterns began as adaptive responses to difficult circumstances, ways of coping with pain, trauma, or unmet developmental needs. By exploring how these patterns developed and what purpose they served, you develop compassion for yourself and insight into the deeper dynamics at play. Jung noted that genuine integration requires symbolic expression. Your unconscious communicates largely through symbols and images rather than rational concepts. Dreams, creative activities, and active imagination provide channels through which shadow content can be expressed and transformed. These symbolic approaches engage the unconscious on its own terms, facilitating integration in ways that purely intellectual understanding cannot achieve. Another crucial aspect of integration involves moving beyond moral absolutes. Jung observed that many people remain trapped in simplistic either-or thinking about their impulses, seeing them as either completely good or completely bad. Integration requires developing what he called a moral relativism, not an abandonment of ethics, but a more nuanced understanding that recognizes the complexity of human motivation and behavior. The integration process also involves grieving. Many addictions represent attempts to compensate for significant losses or disappointments, lost opportunities, unmet potential, abandoned dreams. Before these patterns can transform, you must acknowledge and mourn these losses, allowing yourself to feel the full impact of what wasn't possible or what was taken from you. Perhaps most importantly, integration involves finding constructive channels for the energy previously tied up in addiction. Jung emphasized that merely stopping an addictive behavior creates a vacuum that will inevitably be filled unless you consciously direct that energy elsewhere. Recovery involves discovering what Jung called symbols of transformation, meaningful activities, relationships, or pursuits that engage the same psychological needs in healthier ways. Unlike approaches that promise complete freedom from difficult impulses, Jung's path acknowledges that integration is an ongoing process. The shadow is never completely eliminated, nor should it be. Instead, you develop an evolving relationship with these aspects of yourself, one characterized by awareness, compassion, and choice rather than unconscious compulsion. The ultimate freedom from addiction comes not from achieving some perfect state of purity, but from embracing your full humanity. Jung discovered that paradoxically, it's only by accepting your capacity for dependency that you become truly free from its grip. Through the courageous work of shadow integration, what once controlled you unconsciously becomes a source of wisdom, energy, and authenticity, transforming your greatest struggle into your greatest strength. The path that Jung illuminated is not an easy one. It requires courage, patience, and a willingness to look honestly at yourself. Yet this journey offers something far more valuable than the temporary escape of addiction. It offers genuine transformation and lasting freedom. The secret to overcoming dependency isn't found in perfect self-control or in avoiding your darkest impulses, but in the brave act of turning toward your whole self with awareness and acceptance. Jung recognized that addiction represents not merely a behavioral problem, but a symptom of disconnection from your authentic self, from meaningful purpose, and from the full spectrum of your humanity. The healing process he described involves reconnecting with these lost aspects of yourself, integrating what you've rejected, and channeling your life energy in more conscious and constructive ways. This journey unfolds differently for everyone. For some, it may involve exploring childhood wounds that created the original patterns of escape and avoidance. For others, it might center on discovering creative outlets for emotions previously numbed through substances or behaviors. For many, it includes finding community and connection that satisfy the genuine human need for belonging that addiction counterfeited. What remains consistent across all healing journeys is the movement from unconsciousness to consciousness, from fragmentation to wholeness. As you bring awareness to previously hidden aspects of yourself, the compulsive nature of addiction begins to transform. What once controlled you becomes material for your growth and evolution. Remember that this process isn't about achieving some perfect state of recovery, but about engaging in an ongoing relationship with yourself. There will be setbacks and struggles along the way. Jung would encourage seeing these not as failures, but as opportunities for deeper understanding and integration. Each time you return to awareness after a period of unconsciousness, you strengthen your capacity for conscious choice. The freedom that Jung's approach offers goes beyond merely breaking free from specific dependencies. It represents liberation from the unconscious forces that drive all compulsive behavior. The freedom to live from your authentic center, rather than from unrecognized wounds or external expectations. This is the ultimate promise of the Jungian path, not just recovery from addiction, but discovery of who you truly are. As you continue this journey of self-discovery, remember that the very aspects of yourself that have caused the most suffering also hold the seeds of your greatest strength and wisdom. By embracing rather than rejecting these elements, you transform what once imprisoned you into the foundation of a more authentic, integrated, and meaningful life.